The C-47 Skytrain sat lifeless on the airfield until her old veteran pilot climbed aboard. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into our story. The airfield was silent that morning, the kind of stillness that you can feel in your bones. The C-47 Skytrain, a war veteran itself, sat on the tarmac like a forgotten relic. Her wings, once a symbol of strength and speed, now drooped slightly in defeat, the engines quiet, as if her spirit had left her long ago. There were no loud engines, no clamor of military personnel rushing to get things done. The airfield was deserted, and the C-47 was the last plane left. The mechanics had given up. The techs had come and gone, each one more certain than the last that this aircraft was beyond saving. The plane had not flown in months. It had been grounded after a routine check revealed engine issues that no one could solve. They tried everything, checked the fuel lines, inspected the propellers, and ran diagnostics until the sun set. But nothing worked. The plane was lifeless. The ground crew had started to refer to her as the dead bird. She's just a museum piece now, one of the techs had muttered, wiping grease off his hands. But there was one man who wasn't ready to give up on her, an old veteran who had been watching from the sidelines. His name was Joe Hargrove, a former pilot who had flown more miles in that very C-47 than most could dream of. His hair had grayed, his hands were weathered, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who had spent decades in the cockpit. The crew had seen him before, of course. They knew him as the quiet old guy who hung around, giving advice here and there. He didn't look like much, just another retired vet trying to relive past glory. But they never asked him to leave. Maybe they figured he was harmless. They didn't know the man they were dealing with. Today, Joe didn't say much as he slowly walked up to the plane. He didn't make a scene, didn't bark orders like the young men in uniform would. He just stood there, looking at the old bird, his expression unreadable. The techs rolled their eyes when they saw him. What's he gonna do? One of them snickered. Gonna tell us how to fix it with some old war stories. But Joe wasn't here to tell stories. He was here to do what needed to be done. The young mechanic nearest to him let out a sarcastic laugh. Hey, old man, you want to give it a shot? You think you can get this thing off the ground? Joe didn't answer immediately. He just crouched beside the engine and began to inspect it. The young mechanic was about to make another smart remark when Joe raised his hand. Give me a minute, he said in a low, steady voice. The crew laughed, muttering about how he was wasting time, but Joe didn't mind. He had all the time in the world. He had been in situations where time didn't matter. He knew what it was like to be in the middle of a storm with enemy fire all around and still have to keep calm enough to fix a plane. The young mechanic shook his head. The fuel's fine. The diagnostics are fine. It's just not going to start. It's done. Joe didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his old flight jacket and pulled out a small tool, a wrench that had been with him since his days in the service. He turned it in his hands, as if weighing the weight of the years that had passed. Then, with deliberate movements, he leaned down to work. He didn't need fancy equipment. He knew this plane like the back of his hand. Every screw, every wire, every inch of the C-47 had been etched into his memory. He had flown her through the skies, had seen her perform impossible maneuvers during some of the most dangerous missions in history. And now, as she sat lifeless on the ground, it was his turn to bring her back. The techs continued to mock, but it didn't matter to Joe. He tightened the bolts here, adjusted the valve there, and after a few minutes, stood back up. He wiped his hands on his pants and looked up at the young mechanic. Try it now, he said quietly. The mechanic shook his head, unsure whether to laugh or get angry. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. But he climbed into the cockpit anyway, turning the key to start the engines. For a moment, there was nothing. The silence stretched, but then, the engines sputtered to life. The sound was weak at first, but then it grew stronger, until the C-47 roared to life like an old lion waking from a long slumber. The young mechanic's jaw dropped. The techs froze in their tracks, watching as the plane started to hum with life once more. The crew, who had written her off as dead, were now staring in disbelief. Joe didn't celebrate. He just watched as the C-47's engines purred, the same way they had when he first flew her. He didn't need to say anything. The old bird had done her part, and now she was ready to fly again. But as the plane slowly began to taxi down the runway, Joe stood there, a quiet smile on his face. Some things you don't need to say. The plane did all the talking for him. The engine roared to life, echoing across the airfield, its sound piercing through the silence that had settled over the old C-47 Skytrain. The young mechanic, his eyes wide with disbelief, took his hands off the controls and turned to the rest of the crew. They were all frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and awe as they watched the aircraft come to life before their eyes. Joe Hargrove stood off to the side, his hands still slightly stained with oil, his gaze fixed on the plane that had just come back to life. He didn't smile, didn't nod in satisfaction. He just watched quietly as the machine he had once trusted with his life came back to life in the same way it had in the past. The techs slowly started to move, but none of them said anything. They didn't know what to say. The old veteran had done what they couldn't. They were left in stunned silence, unable to grasp the reality of what had just happened. As the C-47's engines hummed steadily, the crew slowly moved toward the plane, their disbelief still written across their faces. Joe stayed where he was, arms crossed, his posture unwavering. He had done his part. He knew that. But for them, it was a moment of reckoning. They had underestimated him, just as so many others had done throughout his life. He was just an old man in their eyes, a relic of a time long past. But now, they had seen for themselves what he was capable of. It wasn't about the engine, the mechanics, or the tools. It was about knowing the aircraft, understanding it in a way that only years of experience could provide. They wouldn't have understood that. He had always known when to trust his instincts, when to let the machine speak for itself, and when to get his hands dirty to bring it back to life. The C-47 began to taxi down the runway, its wheels rumbling against the tarmac, the sound filling the air as the plane began to pick up speed. Joe stood still, watching, as the old bird gathered momentum, its wings beginning to lift off the ground. There was a moment, just a split second, when he felt the plane rise beneath him, like it was giving one last breath of life before soaring into the sky. The aircraft climbed higher, higher into the air, cutting through the morning fog. The young mechanic finally stepped forward, still unsure of what had just occurred. "How did you?" he started, but Joe cut him off with a simple wave of his hand. "It's not about how," Joe said quietly. "It's about knowing what she's capable of." The technician was silent for a moment, then nodded, understanding something that had eluded him just moments ago. The plane had flown again, not because of fancy diagnostics or the latest technology, but because of an old man who had flown her long ago. He had known her inside and out, had understood every sound, every movement, every shift. She was alive again because of that bond. Joe turned away from the plane, his hands resting in his pockets, his back slightly hunched from years of wear. He had given everything to the Air Force once. But now, in his twilight years, all he wanted was for others to understand the same respect for the machines they operated. It wasn't about speed or glory anymore. It was about something deeper, a connection to the past, to the veterans, who had walked these tarmacs long before. The crew watched him as he walked off the field, his figure becoming smaller in the distance. They were left behind, the hum of the plane still lingering in the air. For Joe Hargrove, it was just another day, another mission completed. But for them, it was a moment that would stay with them forever. The old man had shown them something that no classroom or textbook ever could, what it meant to truly understand the machine. And with that, he had earned their respect. They would never see him the same way again. As the C-47 flew high above them, the young mechanic couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He had seen history come back to life before his very eyes. Joe had given them a lesson in more than just aviation. He had shown them what it meant to honor the past and carry its lessons into the future. The C-47 Skytrain soared high above the airfield, its engines humming smoothly as it climbed into the morning sky. The crew that had once doubted it was now watching in awe from the ground, their gazes fixed on the plane as it became a speck in the vast blue. Joe Hargrove stood in silence, his arms folded across his chest, watching the aircraft disappear into the distance. He knew this was no ordinary flight. It was a lesson for everyone on the ground below. The techs, who had once ridiculed the old machine, now understood the value of experience. They had seen firsthand how a veteran pilot could breathe life into the machine, just as they had once breathed life into it. For Joe, it wasn't about the plane. It was about the connection, the respect for the craft, and the silent bond between a pilot and the aircraft they had spent years flying. The moment felt like a silent victory. Back on the tarmac, the young mechanic who had doubted Joe approached him. He was quiet, his steps slow, as if processing what had just happened. "I didn't think it could be done," he admitted, his voice filled with a mix of respect and disbelief. Joe turned toward him, his face expressionless, but his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "It wasn't about what could or couldn't be done," Joe replied. "It was about understanding the plane." The mechanic nodded, his head still spinning from the unexpected turn of events. "How did you know?" he asked. Joe glanced at the sky, where the C-47 was now a distant figure. "When you've flown as long as I have, you stop thinking in terms of what's broken and start thinking in terms of what still works. Every plane, every machine, has its own rhythm. You just have to know how to listen to it." The mechanic fell silent, processing the wisdom in Joe's words. It was a lesson he would carry with him, a lesson that went beyond just the mechanics of the plane. It was about patience, about experience, and about respect for the craft. As the sound of the C-47's engines began to fade into the distance, the crew turned their attention back to the tarmac. Joe had proven them wrong, not with flashy displays or sophisticated technology, but with years of knowledge and a quiet determination that only a seasoned veteran could possess. As the morning wore on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the techs and the rest of the crew moved about the airfield, but there was a shift in the air. The respect they had once withheld from Joe was now undeniable. They had witnessed a quiet miracle, a testament to the power of experience, and to the veterans who had served in ways the younger generation could only dream of. Joe remained where he was, a solitary figure in the vast, open space of the airfield. He didn't need accolades or applause. He had done his job, and the plane had taken to the skies once again. In the years to come, the techs would remember this day. They would remember the old man who had fixed the unfixable, who had breathed life back into a plane that they had all but given up on. They would remember how he had walked up to that aircraft, calm and steady, and made the impossible happen. And when they saw an old veteran sitting in the corner of the room, quietly observing, they would think back to this day and remember that sometimes the greatest power comes not from the latest technology, but from the quiet strength of experience. Joe turned to leave, his steps slow but steady. He didn't need to say anything more. The lesson had been learned. The aircraft had flown. The veterans had once again shown the younger generation what true strength really was. The morning after the C-47 took to the skies once more, the airfield buzzed with a new energy. The techs and crew who had once dismissed Joe Hargrove were now looking at him with a newfound respect. They had witnessed firsthand what experience could do, and the impossible became a testament to his quiet authority. But Joe wasn't one to bask in glory. He wasn't the kind of man who would demand recognition or attention. He had done his job. The plane was flying, and that was all that mattered to him. As the day went on, the sound of jet engines and helicopters filled the air, but there was a different tone now, one of quiet admiration as Joe walked the tarmac. He wasn't rushing anywhere, just moving at his own pace, his gait steady, like a man who knew the value of time. The young mechanic who had once doubted him approached again, this time with a different demeanor. "Mr. Hargrove," he began, his voice hesitant but respectful, "I just wanted to thank you. I never realized how much I didn't know. I've learned more from you in one day than I did in a year on this base." Joe didn't stop walking, but his eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "Experience isn't something you can teach from a book," he said quietly. "It comes from living through things, from being out there in the field, seeing what works and what doesn't. You'll get there. Just take it one day at a time." The mechanic was quiet for a moment, processing Joe's words. "I guess I never really understood the connection between a pilot and his plane," he admitted. "But now I see it. It's more than just machinery." Joe stopped walking and turned to face the young man. "That's right," he said. "A plane, a boat, a tank. These aren't just machines. They have a soul. They're more than the sum of their parts. And when you've spent enough time with them, they become part of you. You start to understand them in ways that no manual can teach. The mechanic nodded, his eyes full of respect. Joe's words weren't just a lesson in aviation, they were a lesson in life. The plane wasn't just a machine to be fixed, it was a partner in the sky. A companion that had seen its fair share of battles. And just like the pilot, it had its own stories to tell. As Joe continued his walk across the tarmac, his thoughts turned inward. He wasn't here for the techs or the mechanics. He wasn't even here for the military anymore. He was here for the planes, the ones that had served, the ones that had flown, the ones that still had a story to tell. For years, he had been a part of their story, and they had been a part of his. The C-47 had been the first, and it had never let him down. It was a reminder of a time when the skies were full of purpose, and every flight felt like a mission worth completing. But that was years ago. The war was over, and now all he had were the memories. Still, even as the years passed and his body grew older, the call of the sky never left him. He didn't need to fly anymore. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But there was something about being on the tarmac, watching the planes take off and land, that brought it all back. Those days when every flight had a purpose and every mission mattered. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the airfield, Joe stood at the edge of the runway, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The planes were still flying, just as they always had. And as long as there were planes in the sky, there would be veterans like him, quietly watching over them, ready to bring them back to life when they needed it most. The young mechanic stood nearby, his eyes also fixed on the planes as they came in for landing. He had learned something today that would stay with him for the rest of his career. Respect for the craft, respect for the veterans, and respect for the stories they carried with them. Joe wasn't just an old man with a wrench. He was a living piece of history, a man who had seen it all, who had flown through the storms, and who now stood as a quiet witness to a time that was quickly fading from memory. The sound of the C-47's engines as it flew by in the distance was a reminder to them both. The past was never truly gone. It lived on in the planes, in the veterans, and in the stories they carried. As the days passed, the routine on the airfield resumed, but something had changed. The young mechanic who had once doubted Joe Hargrove now found himself thinking differently about the planes, about the veterans who had served, and about the quiet strength that came with experience. It was a change that hadn't gone unnoticed. The other techs and crew members, too, had begun to view Joe in a different light. They no longer saw him as just an old man who hung around the base. They saw him as a master of his craft, someone whose wisdom and knowledge transcended the limitations of time. The airfield, once a place of skepticism and routine, had become a place where respect was earned, not given freely. Joe had shown them all that respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned through action. As he continued his quiet work on the tarmac, Joe had become a fixture on the field. The sound of his boots on the concrete was as familiar as the hum of the engines. He no longer worked with the same intensity he had in his younger years, but he still had the same purpose. He was there to ensure that the planes flew, that the veterans who trusted them would get the same respect he had earned over the years. One afternoon, as Joe sat on a bench near the hangar, sipping coffee and watching the planes take off and land, the young mechanic approached him again. This time, his approach was different. It wasn't out of curiosity or doubt, but out of genuine respect. "Joe," he said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did with the C-47. You proved me wrong. It's not just about the planes, is it? It's about the people who understand them, who've lived with them for so long. I don't think I'll ever see machines the same way again." Joe looked up at the young man, a faint smile crossing his face. "You're getting it," he said softly. "It's not just about fixing things. It's about knowing them. The planes, the people, the machines, they all have stories. You just have to be willing to listen." The mechanic nodded, a look of realization settling over him. "I think I finally understand," he said, a new sense of purpose in his voice. "It's not just a job. It's a legacy." Joe's smile widened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The mechanic had learned the most important lesson of all, that respect for the craft, the veterans, and the machines was something that couldn't be taught in a classroom. It had to be earned over time, through hard work, and through living with the very machines you were tasked with maintaining. As the mechanic turned to walk away, Joe's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The planes were still flying, their engines cutting through the sky like they had done for decades. The sound of their engines was a reminder of everything that had come before, everything that had been accomplished. It was a reminder that, even as time moved on, some things never truly changed. Joe had flown these skies, fought in them, and now, he watched over them from the ground. The planes, the veterans, the airfield, they were all connected, bound by a shared history that would never fade. As the young mechanic disappeared into the hangar, Joe stood up, stretched, and walked to the edge of the tarmac. He watched the planes, the same ones he had once flown, soar into the sky, and for a moment, he was back there again, in the cockpit, the wind rushing past him as he soared through the clouds. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, his job was to make sure the planes could still fly, that they would continue to serve the men and women who had followed in his footsteps. The airfield was no longer just a place where planes took off and landed. It had become a place of honor, where the legacy of those who had served lived on in every plane, every engine, and every veteran who walked across its grounds. Joe Hargrove was no longer just a veteran who had seen it all. He was a living piece of history, a man who had dedicated his life to the machines that had once carried him through the skies, and now, he was there to ensure that they would carry others. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Joe knew his work was far from over. There were still planes to fix, still veterans to respect, and still stories to be told. And as long as he was there, he would continue to listen to those stories, to honor the past, and to make sure the legacy of those who had served would never be forgotten. The following weeks on the airfield continued in much the same way. The planes flew, the techs worked, and Joe Hargrove went about his business, quietly fixing what needed to be fixed and offering advice when asked. But there was a new respect in the air. The young mechanic who had once been so dismissive of Joe was now working side by side with him, learning from the old veteran. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was with a mutual understanding. Joe didn't need to explain the things he had learned over the years. The mechanic was starting to pick it up on his own. One morning, as Joe was inspecting a set of old military trucks, a familiar voice called out from behind him. It was the young mechanic. "Joe," he said, his tone a bit more urgent than usual. "I think we've got a problem with the hangar door." Joe didn't respond right away, instead continuing to inspect the engine he had in front of him. But when he heard the tension in the mechanic's voice, he stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. "Lead the way," he said. The young mechanic led Joe to the hangar, where a large metal door, one that had been there for as long as anyone could remember, was stuck halfway open. "It's been like this for a while now," the mechanic said. "The crews tried everything to get it working, but it won't budge." Joe took one look at the door, then glanced around at the crew that had gathered nearby. There was an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. The crew had tried to fix the problem themselves, but hadn't been able to. They had all given up. Joe knelt down, studying the mechanism carefully. He didn't rush, didn't try to force anything. He just looked, listened, and thought. The mechanic and the crew waited in the background, watching him. "You've been using all the wrong tools," Joe said after a moment, his voice calm and steady. "This is about the gears, not the motor. You need to approach it from the right angle." The young mechanic stepped forward, intrigued but still unsure. "But we've tried everything," he said. "We checked the gears." Joe didn't respond right away. Instead, he bent down and used his hands to slowly turn a small, rusted bolt. He worked carefully, his movements methodical, like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The others watched, some skeptical, others curious. After a few minutes of quiet work, Joe stood up and nodded toward the door. "Try it now," he said. The mechanic hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the control panel and hit the switch. Slowly, the large metal door began to move, creaking at first, then moving more smoothly as the gears turned. The crew stared in disbelief as the door slid open fully, the sound of the mechanism working perfectly. The young mechanic turned to Joe, his mouth slightly agape. "How did you know?" he asked. Joe simply smiled, his eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who had seen it all. "It's not about brute force," Joe said quietly. "It's about knowing what's inside. Every machine has its own rhythm. Once you understand that, it's all just a matter of patience and experience." The crew slowly began to gather around, murmuring to each other in awe. The young mechanic gave Joe a slow, respectful nod. "I think I finally get it," he said. Joe turned and walked away, his boots tapping lightly on the concrete. The rest of the crew followed him with their eyes, a deep sense of respect now in their gaze. Joe didn't need to say much. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He had proven once again that experience and knowledge couldn't be replaced by fancy tools or new technology. It was something that only came with years of hard work and dedication. As Joe moved toward the tarmac, he heard the sound of the planes in the distance, their engines roaring as they took off into the sky. It was a familiar sound, one that brought back memories of the past, of the days when he had flown high above the world. Those days were gone, but in his heart, Joe knew that the planes would always be there, just as they had always been. He had done his part, and now it was time for the younger generation to take the reins. But as long as Joe was around, he would keep doing what he did best, making sure the planes flew, and making sure the legacy of those who had come before him never faded. He had earned his place on that airfield, not because of his age or his rank, but because of the respect he had for the machines and the people who had worked with him. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the airfield, Joe knew that he had done his job. The planes were in the sky, and that was all that mattered. The airfield had become more than just a place for planes to take off and land. It had turned into a sanctuary of sorts, a place where stories were told through every turn of the wrench, every push of the throttle, and every flight into the sky. For Joe Hargrove, this was where he had always felt at home, and even though the years were catching up to him, the work was never done. It was early one morning when the call came in, the kind of call Joe had learned to listen for, even when it seemed quiet. The mechanic who had once doubted him was now a full-fledged part of the crew, and his voice crackled through the radio with urgency. "Joe, we've got a problem. One of the planes is acting up, and we need you down here." Joe didn't hesitate. His boots hit the tarmac with the familiar rhythm, and he made his way to the hangar. As he walked, he could feel the weight of the years, but his stride was steady. He had done this 1,000 times, and he knew that today wouldn't be any different. When he reached the hangar, the young mechanic was waiting for him, a look of concern on his face. "It's the old bomber," he said. "The B-17. It's been grounded for a while, but now it's giving us more trouble. We've tried everything, but it won't start." Joe nodded. The B-17 was a relic, a flying fortress from a bygone era, and while its legacy was respected, it wasn't the easiest machine to handle. "Show me," Joe said, and the mechanic led him to the massive aircraft. The crew had already tried all the usual methods, checking the fuel lines, testing the engines, running diagnostics. But nothing worked. The engines were dead, and the plane was grounded once more. Joe studied the B-17, his eyes scanning the familiar shape of the old bomber. He could almost hear the stories of those who had flown it during the war. This plane had seen things that most people would never understand. It had flown through some of the most dangerous skies in history, and now it was here, waiting to be brought back to life. "What's the problem?" Joe asked as he crouched beside the engine. The young mechanic sighed. "We think it's the ignition system, but we can't find the problem. The systems keep checking out fine, but nothing's firing up." Joe didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking, his hands moving over the engine with a familiarity that the mechanic hadn't expected. He wasn't rushing, just working through it methodically. "You know," Joe said after a moment, his voice calm and steady, "it's not always about the system. Sometimes you need to listen to the plane. Every machine has a story to tell, and this one's just waiting for you to hear it." The mechanic stared at Joe, unsure of what he meant, but he didn't question it. Joe had earned his place here. The plane was old, but Joe knew that wasn't the issue. It wasn't the age of the aircraft or the technology inside it. It was about understanding the history of the machine, knowing what had worked and what hadn't. After a few more minutes of careful inspection, Joe stopped. "It's the spark plugs," he said. "They're old, worn out. But more importantly, they've got a buildup of carbon that's blocking the connection." The mechanic was silent for a moment, then nodded. "You think that'll fix it?" Joe didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for the crew to bring over a set of new spark plugs. "Sometimes," he said, "it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference." The young mechanic watched as Joe swapped out the old plugs with the new ones, his hands moving with precision and care. The crew had tried to replace parts before, but they hadn't thought to check the spark plugs. They hadn't listened to the plane, hadn't given it the chance to speak. When the new plugs were in place, Joe stood up and stepped back, wiping his hands on. his pants. "Now try it," he said. The mechanic hesitated, then moved to the cockpit. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the ignition key, and for a moment, there was nothing. But then, slowly, the engine sputtered to life. The crew gasped in surprise as the engines roared to life, the familiar hum filling the air once more. The B-17 was alive again. The young mechanic turned to Joe, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How did you know?" he asked. Joe smiled faintly. "Experience," he said simply. "Experience and listening. Every plane has a story, but you've got to be patient enough to hear it." The crew stood in awe as the B-17 slowly began to roll down the runway, its engines humming steadily. The mechanic who had once doubted Joe now understood. The planes weren't just machines, they were partners. And Joe, the old veteran who had spent his life with these machines, knew how to listen to them in ways that no one else could. As the B-17 took off into the sky, Joe watched from the tarmac, his heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just about fixing planes. It was about honoring the past, honoring the veterans who had flown them, and keeping their legacy alive. Joe had done his part, and now, he could rest knowing that the story of the B-17, and the others like it, would continue on. As the weeks passed, the old airfield continued to hum with activity. Joe Hargrove, now firmly respected by everyone, carried on with his work, quietly fixing whatever was needed, offering advice when necessary, but mostly staying to himself. The younger mechanics had learned a lot from him, not just about planes, but about respect, patience, and the quiet power of experience. One day, as Joe was walking past the hangar, he was stopped by a familiar voice. It was the young mechanic, now much more confident, his tone a little different. "Joe, we've got a situation," he said, his brow furrowed. Joe, without saying a word, turned and followed the mechanic toward the hangar. Inside, a military helicopter sat in the middle of the floor, its rotor blades still. The crew was clustered around it, scratching their heads. "What's the issue?" Joe asked, already sensing the tension in the air. "It's the engine. We can't figure out what's wrong with it," the mechanic explained. "We've checked everything, and still, it won't start." Joe moved closer, his eyes scanning the helicopter. He had seen this kind of thing before. The machine was fine, but somewhere along the line, something had been overlooked. He knelt down and began to inspect the engine carefully, his hands moving with the kind of precision only years of experience could teach. The crew stood silently, watching him, not daring to interrupt. "We've checked the fuel lines, tested the ignition system, and even ran a full diagnostic. Everything seems fine," the mechanic said. Joe didn't reply immediately, continuing his inspection. The sounds of the other mechanics discussing possible issues faded into the background as Joe focused on the task at hand. After a few minutes, he looked up. "It's the throttle linkage," he said simply. The mechanic looked confused. "The throttle?" he asked. "But we've checked it already." Joe nodded slowly. "You checked it, but you didn't test it under load," he said, standing up. "The system works fine when it's idle, but when the engine is running, the linkage is slipping. It's not engaging properly." The mechanic's eyes widened as he processed Joe's words. "You think that's it?" Joe smiled faintly. "It's not about the tools or the diagnostics," he said. "It's about knowing how the machine works. You've got to think like it. The machine's telling you something, but you're not listening to it." The crew had never seen Joe speak with such authority, but now they were hanging on his every word. Joe's experience was not just about fixing things. It was about understanding them on a deeper level. The young mechanic turned and signaled to one of the other techs to get the necessary tools. Joe knelt by the throttle, and after a few moments, he adjusted the linkage, tightening a small but crucial screw. "Try it now," he said. The mechanic moved quickly to the cockpit, his hands steady but eager. He turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. The rotor blades began to spin, and the helicopter lifted slightly off the ground, its engine humming steadily. The crew erupted in cheers, but Joe just stood there, watching quietly. "It's all about listening," Joe said again, more to himself than to anyone else. "Machines talk to you. You've just got to know how to hear them." The young mechanic stepped forward, looking at Joe with newfound admiration. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "It's like you can just feel the problem." Joe shrugged. "It's not magic. It's experience. You'll get there. It just takes time." The mechanic nodded, understanding more than just the technical side of the job. He was beginning to understand what Joe had been teaching him all along. Later that afternoon, as Joe walked back to the tarmac, he found himself thinking about how much had changed. The younger crew, the ones who had once dismissed him as just an old man, now sought his advice and listened when he spoke. They had begun to understand that experience and wisdom weren't things that could be learned overnight. They were earned over time, through hard work, failures, and successes. And now, as Joe continued his quiet work on the airfield, he could see that the legacy of the veterans who had served before him was in good hands. The younger generation was starting to carry that torch, passing on the knowledge and respect that had been given to them. The planes, the helicopters, the machines, they were still here, still flying, still serving. And Joe, even as his years on this earth grew shorter, knew that as long as he could still help, he would continue to listen to the machines, to the planes, and to the legacy of those who had come before him. The days continued to pass on the airfield, each one bringing a new challenge, a new lesson, and another step toward the inevitable change that came with time. Joe Hargrove, though, remained a constant. His presence had become a quiet cornerstone of the base, a reminder of what it meant to be a veteran, to have lived through the ups and downs, to have experienced things that no one else could truly understand. The young mechanic, who had once been so full of skepticism, was now Joe's closest ally on the tarmac. They worked side by side, sharing ideas, solving problems, and even enjoying the rare moments of peace that came with a quiet afternoon. But Joe wasn't the only one who had noticed the changes. The other crew members, too, were beginning to recognize the importance of what Joe had been trying to teach them all along. It wasn't just about fixing planes or helicopters or engines. It was about respect. It was about understanding that the machines they worked on weren't just pieces of metal and wires. They were part of a greater legacy, a legacy that had been built on the hard work and dedication of veterans like Joe. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Joe stood by the hangar, watching a B-52 bomber take off in the distance. The roar of the engines echoed across the field, reminding him of the days when he had been in the cockpit, flying high above the earth. It was a familiar feeling, one that he would never fully shake. Even though his flying days were behind him, the sky still called to him in a way that nothing else could. The young mechanic approached him, his face filled with a mix of excitement and something else, something more serious. "Joe," he said, pausing for a moment as if to gather his thoughts. "I've been thinking. You've taught me a lot about the planes, about the work. But there's something else. Something more. It's the way you treat the machines, the way you listen to them. I don't think I've ever truly understood that until now." Joe turned to face him, his expression soft but knowing. "You're getting it," he said simply. "It's about respect. It's not just about the job. It's about understanding. When you listen to the machines, when you really pay attention to what they're telling you, that's when you can make a difference. It's a lesson that goes beyond aviation. It's about life." The young mechanic nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He had come a long way since that first day when he had doubted Joe's ability to fix the planes. Now, he knew that Joe's experience and wisdom weren't just something to admire. They were something to follow. "I think I'm starting to understand," the mechanic said. "It's not about fixing the problem as quickly as possible. It's about knowing when to stop, when to listen, and when to act." Joe smiled faintly, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Exactly. It's about taking your time, trusting your instincts, and doing things the right way, not the fast way." The mechanic stood silently for a moment, then looked out at the planes on the runway. "I've never been part of something like this," he said quietly. "I've never understood what it meant to be part of a team, to be part of something bigger than just myself." Joe followed his gaze, watching the planes take off and land, each one a symbol of something greater than the sum of its parts. "You're part of something now," Joe said, his voice steady and calm. "We all are. This is more than just a job. It's a legacy of those who came before us, who fought, who flew, who worked hard to keep these machines in the air. And now, it's our turn to carry that legacy forward." The mechanic looked at Joe, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "I won't forget this," he said quietly. Joe nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. He didn't need to say more. The mechanic had learned what he needed to learn. The lesson had been passed on. As the sun set behind the hangar, casting a golden glow over the tarmac, Joe Hargrove turned and walked away, his boots steady on the ground. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The work was done. The planes were flying. And the legacy was alive, carried forward by those who understood its true meaning. As Joe disappeared into the shadows, the young mechanic stood there for a moment longer, watching the planes soar into the sky. For the first time, he understood the depth of the work he had been doing. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about carrying on a legacy, honoring the past, and making sure that the planes, the veterans, and the stories they carried would never be forgotten. As time passed, the rhythm of life on the airfield continued, but for Joe Hargrove, something felt different now. He had become more than just the veteran who quietly maintained the planes. He was a mentor, a teacher, someone who had lived through the battles and now shared the lessons with a younger generation. The young mechanic, now fully immersed in his work, had become a trusted partner. Joe didn't have to explain everything anymore. The mechanic could look at a plane, understand the issues, and know exactly where to start. But there were days when Joe would still step in, offering that quiet guidance that only comes with decades of experience. One chilly morning, as the team prepared for a new set of flights, a problem arose that no one expected. A jet, newly serviced and ready for flight, began to sputter on the runway. The engineers had gone over it countless times, but now, as it struggled to take off, there was panic in the air. The mechanic rushed toward the plane, but Joe raised his hand, stopping him. "Take a step back," Joe said. The mechanic paused, confused. "We've checked everything, Joe. I don't know what's wrong." Joe didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the jet, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the cockpit. The crew followed at a distance, watching as he leaned over the open hatch, his eyes scanning the interior. He didn't immediately start fiddling with wires or tools. He stood still for a moment, listening. The jet's engine was making a strange, intermittent noise, a hum that didn't sound right. Joe tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. "It's the power supply," he said. "It's not getting enough voltage to the ignition system. The engines can't reach the right RPM to take off." The mechanic blinked. "But we checked the power systems already." Joe nodded slowly. "You did, but you didn't listen closely enough. The systems were reading fine, but something was off. You need to check the wiring going to the ignition. The connection's loose." The mechanic was about to argue when he saw the steady, sure way Joe was approaching the problem. "I'll check it out," he said, and Joe stepped aside, allowing him to work. It didn't take long for the mechanic to find the issue. A single wire had come loose from its terminal, preventing the ignition system from receiving enough power. He quickly tightened it, and within minutes, the jet's engine roared to life, steady and strong. The team breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the young mechanic looked up at Joe, a look of awe in his eyes. "You always know exactly what to look for," he said. Joe smiled faintly. "It's not about knowing everything. It's about knowing how to look, how to listen. The machines speak to you if you're patient enough." The mechanic nodded, his respect for Joe growing even more. But Joe wasn't interested in praise. He was already turning away, ready to get back to work. He didn't need accolades or recognition. For him, this was what he had always done, what he had always loved. As the team got the jet ready for takeoff, the mechanic couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. Just months ago, he had been the one who doubted Joe's ability, questioning his methods, dismissing his calm approach. But now he understood. Joe's quiet confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the result of years of experience, of learning to read the machines, of knowing that the job wasn't just about fixing things, it was about understanding them, building a relationship with the machines that transcended tools and parts. As the jet lifted off the runway and climbed into the sky, the mechanic watched it disappear into the distance. The sound of its engines echoed across the airfield, a symbol of the machines that Joe had spent his life caring for. The mechanic smiled to himself. He had learned something invaluable. He had learned that the legacy of a veteran wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, passing on knowledge, respecting the craft, and listening to the machines that kept the world running. Joe was more than just a man who fixed planes. He was the keeper of stories, of lessons, of a history that had shaped the world they lived in. And now, it was up to the next generation to carry that torch forward. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the airfield, the mechanic stood there for a long time, watching the planes soar overhead. The lessons Joe had taught him would stay with him forever, and he knew he had a responsibility to carry them forward, to respect the legacy of the veterans who had come before, and to pass that knowledge down to the next generation. For Joe, that was the true meaning of the work, ensuring that the legacy never faded, that the machines, the veterans, and the lessons they carried would continue to live on, long after they were gone. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life on the airfield continued. The planes, always a constant presence in the skies, came and went with precision. The crew was becoming more cohesive, working like a well-oiled machine, their respect for Joe Hargrove evident in every action. He was no longer just the old veteran. He had become the mentor, the guide, the steady hand that ensured things ran smoothly. It was another crisp morning when the call came in. A jet, freshly refueled and ready for takeoff, was having trouble with its hydraulic systems. The crew had already gone over everything, but they couldn't pinpoint the issue. The technician on duty, a young man who had been with the crew for just a few months, was starting to panic. Joe, who had been walking across the tarmac, noticed the commotion and approached. The mechanic was standing next to the jet, staring at the system's monitor, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. "Joe, we've got a problem," the mechanic said, his voice tight. "The hydraulic pressure's fluctuating. We've checked all the components, but it's still failing. We don't know what else to do." Joe nodded slowly, his gaze scanning the jet, his mind already at work. "Let me take a look," he said quietly. The crew stepped aside, giving Joe the space to do what he did best. He didn't rush, didn't immediately dive into the diagnostics. Instead, he stood by the jet, listening to the hum of the systems and observing the flow of the pressure gauges. The others watched, waiting for some sign of what he would do next. After a few moments, Joe crouched down beside the hydraulic lines, running his hands along the tubing, his fingers gently tapping the joints. The young mechanic looked on, eager for any clue as to what might be causing the issue. Joe didn't speak right away. He had seen this before. The jet's hydraulic system was relatively simple, but it could be tricky if something small was overlooked. The problem wasn't with the components, it was with the flow. Joe's eyes narrowed as he focused on the connections. The system was fine, it just wasn't getting the right pressure from one of the valves. Without a word, he signaled the mechanic to bring over the tools. The young technician scrambled to get them, his hands trembling slightly. "What's the issue?" the mechanic asked, still unsure of what Joe had discovered. Joe stood up, his hands resting on the side of the jet. "The valve's clogged. It's a small thing, but it's affecting the flow. The system looks fine on paper, but there's a blockage you can't see with the diagnostic tools." The mechanic's face lit up with realization. "A blockage?" he repeated. "But we checked it." Joe nodded. "You checked it, but you didn't test it. Under pressure, the blockage is small, but when the pressure builds up, it's enough to throw everything off." The technician quickly got to work, following Joe's instructions. As he removed the valve, the crew gathered around, watching as he cleaned it out carefully, making sure no debris remained. The jet's hydraulic system had to be perfect for takeoff, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Once the valve was cleared and reassembled, the young mechanic tested the system again. This time, the pressure readings were steady. "It's working," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "It's working perfectly." The crew cheered, relieved that they had solved the problem. The mechanic turned to Joe, his eyes full of respect. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "You always seem to know exactly where to look." Joe smiled faintly, his gaze shifting to the sky where a plane was soaring high above the airfield. "It's not about being perfect," Joe replied. "It's about understanding. You can't fix what you don't understand." The mechanic nodded, taking Joe's words to heart. Over the past few months, he had learned so much from the old veteran. It wasn't just about the machines, it was about the process, understanding how everything worked, how it all connected, and how to fix things when they went wrong. The technician who had been so eager to prove himself was now beginning to see the value in taking the time to understand the systems, the planes, and the legacy that Joe had spent his life maintaining. As the jet was cleared for takeoff and the crew prepared for the next flight, Joe stepped back, watching the plane roar down the runway. The sound of the engines was familiar to him, comforting. It was the sound of something working, of something still alive. And as long as he was there, as long as he could help, he would continue to listen to the machines, continuing the work that had defined his life. The mechanic watched the jet take off, his eyes filled with admiration for the man who had shown him what it meant to truly respect the machines they worked on. He knew that Joe had more to teach, more to share, and as long as he was willing to listen, he would keep learning. The legacy of the veterans would live on, not just in the machines, but in the people who had come to understand them. Joe had passed on that lesson, and now it was his turn to carry it forward. Months passed, and the airfield, once a quiet and routine place, had transformed. The crew had grown, not just in skill, but in understanding, respect, and camaraderie. Joe Hargrove, now a central figure on the base, had continued his work with a quiet dignity. He was no longer just the veteran who had flown in battles long past, but the bridge between the history of the planes and the future of those who maintained them. The young mechanic, once full of skepticism and doubt, had transformed. He was no longer the eager but uncertain rookie. He had become one of the team, a trusted technician whose confidence grew with every task. Joe's mentorship had not only taught him about the planes, but about the essence of the work itself. One morning, as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, the quiet hum of the airfield was interrupted by an unusual order. A high-ranking officer had arrived, a lieutenant colonel who had been called in for a special task. The young mechanic was just finishing up a routine check when the officer approached him, along with two others from the command. "You, come with us," the lieutenant colonel said, motioning for him to follow. "We need your expertise." The mechanic, confused, followed the group to the hangar, where an unexpected sight awaited him. A vintage bomber, one that had been grounded for years, sat in the center of the hangar. It was an aircraft that had seen its fair share of history, its engines silent, its body showing signs of wear, but it still held an undeniable presence. "What's the problem?" the mechanic asked, still unsure. "It's a restoration project," the lieutenant colonel explained. "We need you to bring it back to life, but it's not just about fixing it. We need to see if it can still fly." The mechanic looked over the bomber, his mind racing. This was no ordinary plane. It had been decommissioned for years, and its condition had deteriorated over time. The pressure was mounting, but he couldn't back down. The challenge had been laid out before him, and it was his time to prove what he had learned. He immediately thought of Joe. He needed to approach this like Joe would, methodically, with respect for the machine and its history. The young mechanic began his inspection, carefully walking around the bomber, noting every detail. The wings, the engines, the interior, all of it told a story. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. He would need to take his time. As he worked, he found himself thinking about Joe's teachings. "Listen to the plane," Joe had said. "Every machine has a rhythm. You just have to understand it." The mechanic carefully examined the engine, testing each part, checking the fuel system, and assessing the wiring. He could hear the hum of the engines outside, the sound of planes taking off and landing, but inside the hangar, it was quiet. Only the occasional clink of tools and the soft sounds of the mechanic working. Hours passed, but he never rushed. Every time he thought he had found a solution, he tested it, making sure that it was right before moving on. The team waited, but the mechanic didn't look up. He wasn't there for applause or praise. He was there to fix the bomber and prove that it could still fly. Finally, after a long day of inspection and testing, the mechanic stood back, wiped his hands on his pants, and turned to the lieutenant colonel. "It's ready," he said, his voice calm but confident. "The engines are running fine, and the systems are working like they should. We're good to go." The officer looked at him, impressed. "You really think it'll fly?" the colonel asked. "Yes," the mechanic replied. "It's not about thinking it will. It's about knowing it will." The plane just needed the right attention. With a nod from the lieutenant colonel, the team began preparing the bomber for its first flight in years. The mechanic climbed into the cockpit, running through the pre-flight checks. As the engines roared to life, the airfield felt different, charged with energy and anticipation. The aircraft began to taxi, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The young mechanic could feel his heart racing. This wasn't just any flight. This was a test of everything he had learned. With a steady hand, he guided the bomber down the runway. As it lifted off the ground, he felt the familiar rush of air beneath him. The plane was flying. The team erupted in applause, watching. As the bomber soared through the sky, its engines strong and steady. The young mechanic's eyes remained fixed on the aircraft, a sense of pride swelling inside him. He had done it. He had brought the plane back to life. And as he glanced out over the airfield, he knew this moment was a turning point. Joe Hargrove's lessons had not just been about fixing planes. They had been about understanding the history, respecting the legacy, and listening to the stories the machines had to tell. As the bomber circled above, the young mechanic felt a sense of gratitude for everything he had learned, for the man who had taught him, and for the machine that had once again taken flight. The days began to blur together as the airfield's usual hum filled the air once again. The planes flew, the mechanics worked, and Joe Hargrove continued his quiet routine. The younger generation had absorbed everything they could from him, and now it was their turn to carry on his legacy. The lessons he had imparted were more than just about fixing machines. They were about understanding the value of patience, respect, and the deep connection between a pilot and the plane. It wasn't long before the young mechanic, now fully skilled in his craft, stood in front of the hangar, watching the planes soar into the sky. He knew this moment was inevitable. Joe had taught him everything he needed to know. The quiet old man had passed on his wisdom, and now he would carry it forward, not just in the planes he fixed, but in the way he carried himself, in the respect he showed for the machines and for those who came before him. One afternoon, Joe came to him, his usual steady pace not showing a sign of wear. "I think it's time," Joe said quietly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the mechanic pause. "Time for what?" the mechanic asked, confused. Joe nodded toward the tarmac, where a vintage bomber sat, ready for a test flight. The mechanic glanced at the old aircraft and back to Joe. "I'm not sure I'm ready," the mechanic admitted, his voice filled with uncertainty. Joe gave a slight smile. "You're more ready than you think. It's not about being perfect, it's about doing what needs to be done. You've learned well. Trust yourself." Joe's words echoed in the mechanic's mind. For months, he had watched Joe work with unwavering confidence, never doubting his own skills. Now, it was his turn to step up. He had come a long way from the unsure technician he once was. With a steadying breath, the mechanic nodded and climbed into the cockpit of the bomber. The engine rumbled to life, its sound reverberating through the airfield. The rest of the crew gathered around, watching as the mechanic conducted the pre-flight checks, just as Joe had taught him. With each move, each adjustment, the mechanic felt a growing confidence. This wasn't just about fixing planes. It was about honoring the legacy of the veterans who had flown before him, of those who had given their time, their energy, and their lives to ensure that these machines would fly. As he taxied the bomber to the runway, the mechanic felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The aircraft was old, yes, but it was alive in its own way, a testament to the history it carried. And now, it was his turn to make sure it soared again. The plane picked up speed, the wind rushing past as the mechanic guided it down the runway. It felt like everything he had learned, everything Joe had taught him, was coming together in that moment. As the plane lifted off the ground, he felt a wave of pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was flying. The engines roared as the bomber climbed into the sky, steady and true. The mechanic, now fully immersed in the process, guided the aircraft higher, letting the wings cut through the air with the precision Joe had instilled in him. Below, the rest of the crew watched in awe as the bomber soared overhead, the pride of the airfield now in the hands of a new generation. When the mechanic finally brought the plane back to the tarmac, he felt the satisfaction of a job well done, not just in fixing the machine, but in living up to the expectations Joe had set. As he taxied the plane to a stop, he turned off the engines, letting the silence of the airfield settle in around him. The crew gathered around, clapping and cheering. The young mechanic smiled but looked past them, toward Joe, who stood off to the side, watching quietly. The old veteran's gaze was steady, full of pride, but it was the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. The mechanic stepped out of the cockpit, his legs a bit unsteady but his heart full. He walked toward Joe, who met him halfway. "You did well," Joe said simply, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the mechanic pause. He wanted to say something, to express the gratitude he felt, but words didn't seem enough. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said instead, his voice thick with emotion. Joe smiled faintly. "You did it because you listened, and you respected the machine. That's all I ever wanted." The mechanic nodded, feeling the full weight of Joe's words. They had never been just about fixing the planes. They had been about understanding them, about respecting the history they carried. And now, It was his turn to pass that lesson on to the next generation. As the sun began to set over the airfield, casting a warm golden light across the tarmac, the mechanic knew that this moment wasn't just his success. It was Joe's too. The legacy of the veterans lived on, not just in the planes they had flown, but in the people who kept them flying, who respected them, and who honored the history they carried. Joe had taught him that, and now, he would carry it forward, ensuring that the machines, the veterans, and their stories would never be forgotten. This emotional story takes you on a journey through the life of an old veteran who imparts his wisdom and experience to a younger mechanic. From fixing old aircraft to teaching the value of respecting the machines and the history they carry, this story captures the essence of what it means to honor the past while preparing for the future. With each challenge that arises on the airfield, the mechanic learns the deeper lessons that go beyond technical skills. The emotional story highlights the mentor-mentee relationship between the two, showcasing the significance of passing down knowledge and respect. As the young mechanic faces obstacles, Joe's steady guidance helps him not only fix the machines, but understand them on a personal level. Through every task, the mechanic grows and eventually proves himself in a pivotal moment, flying a vintage bomber with confidence. This emotional story not only celebrates the work done on the airfield, but also honors the veterans who have dedicated their lives to preserving history. The connection between the veterans, the planes, and the younger generation is at the heart of this emotional story. As the mechanic masters the lessons Joe taught him, it becomes clear that this emotional story is about more than just fixing planes. It's about listening, learning, and carrying forward a legacy that will never be forgotten.